Hello world of YouTube, and welcome to another episode of Redacted, the show where I take a look at records that have a solid foundation but a spotty execution and making a smoother listening experience out of it all. This month we got a couple boxes I'm ticking off. We're really synergizing the show and also just keeping true to the stuff I've been trying to keep true to with the themes of second chances on the channel. And so this is not only a second chance, because this is one of the albums I had on the poll in July, which means it's also a topical release, because that was the whole theme of that poll. But it's also the celebration of the 10-year anniversary of this record. Even if this record is potentially my least favorite in the band's discography, I say potentially because the record from this year in question by the band is also pretty fucking bizarringly bad in ways that are the complete opposite of the album that I'm talking about in this video. The album in question was also a point where the band decided to experiment and acted as the only contributions to this band done by the drummer, who had huge shoes to fill within the context of this band, which is a component that I also decided to use when pulling together songs to do for this album. I know this setup is going on for a while, but again, this album just needed to happen this year. I know I haven't been doing a whole lot of 2013 was a long time ago content like I did last year with 2012, and I wanted to do another 2013 happened 10 years ago bit as well, okay? The album is the 6th project by California hard rock metal band Avenged Sevenfold. The 2013 flop, in my opinion, Hail to the King. I just talked about how much I didn't like their newest album, Life is But a Dream, and I think that that album is a whirlwind of ideas that kind of makes sense with some experiments the band has done, but felt tapped into in a lot of ways that I just think weren't it, Chief. Which could be a reason why it might be my least favorite, but as it stood in my reformatted discography review of this band I dropped on the Patreon that I now have to rework because Life is But a Dream exists, Hail to the King is a project that acts as an interesting deviation, if only because it sees Avenged Sevenfold trying to experiment in the blandest way possible. Not only does it try to have this sonic pivot in a sort arrangement-wise by leaning into some of the gaudier, more theatrical aspects that were in components of Nightmare, but also integrates some more hard rock metal pivots in a similar lane of like the blues influence scene from a record like Metallica's Black Album, which has never worked for me. I've been a hater of this album since it came out. I still think it's just a slice of this band's discography that didn't work, and part of it has to do with the fact that they're underutilizing a component of this band that I really do think is important to the band as far as their sound is considered, and it's their drums. No disrespect to Aaron L.J. I know this was the only time he worked with the band, but this record I don't think really was a credit to his abilities as a drummer in some regards. And while I can admire them really doubling down on really leaning into that influence in aspects of Hail to the King that I don't think are the strongest in the band's catalog, but aren't like musically unsound, I understand why this record does have fans, and some components of it I have grown to enjoy to some caliber. That being said, one of the things I aimed to do with this record when redacting it was take a look at some of that theatricality scene and some of the songwriting and how some of those arrangement and production styles help gloss that up in some good ways and give them a better chance to shine by creating a sort of narrative framework within this record and have a sort of follow-through of events while swapping some of the tracks I don't like out for some of the Call of Duty tracks that Aaron L.J. also contributed drums for, that I think not only show off his drumming prowess a little bit better, also sort of help sonically unify this era with their discography a little more cohesively. I can respect a good pivot, but there's just some points on Hail to the King where this just kind of flounders in a compositional aspect, and given that this is relatively a one-to-one swap episode, given I do have 11 tracks to the 10-track original, the end of the record, especially the last track on here, more plays into a coda and is also a bonus track, so I can use the original structure of the album and really critique my problems with it while also presenting a version of the record that I think is just a better listening experience. My version is also 4 minutes longer, which without that 11-track coda outro sort of song, actually puts this album a minute shorter than the original. Was that minute shorter worth it? Let's go ahead and show off the track listing before getting into the nitty-gritty of how I laid out the track listing, how I did.
You can't save my areas I trust will fail. Hell to the world, kneel to the crowds. After all, everybody's doing their time. If the matching of the earth in flames and crimson eyes, final demise. Know me by name, shepherd of fire. Out of the will of those who can fight to take back the passion to live. And all roads end, I'll be coming home. There's no death, no end of time when I'm facing it with you. Never a stranger to late night snake bite, fist fights, and empty pints.
I like Shepherd of Fire. I think that it is a good theatrical hard rock song. And I think that it's a great character piece. I just think it's a weird intro for this album that dabbles in thematics and not narrative, but world building. So I keep it, but I move it to way later in the record. Instead, I start this album with the first song they released with Aaron LJ, the song Not Ready to Die, which was a tie-in track recorded for Call of Duty Black Ops, a game I've never even played. I'm not a COD guy. I've talked about that. I did the whole Not a Bro sketch. I also figured I'd talk about this because, you know, the extra songs also have history, and this album, again, I wanted to kind of use as also a tribute to Aaron LJ's tenure with the band. I know that the games are important to a certain generation of gamers. I'm just not a part of that part of gaming. I do like the song, though. I actually bought it on iTunes back in the day. I said, fuck Call of Duty. I didn't want to hear the new Avenged Sevenfold song with their new drummer, though, because that's one of my biggest takeaways from Avenged Sevenfold is their drums. I like the band as a whole. I think that they are very talented. But any of the Rev's drums are just something special. I think he's a very good drummer. And I think that Not Ready to Die was a good introduction to this kid filling in those shoes. It's also got some of that gothic-inspired, you know, chorus-style organ to introduce it with the swirling arpeggio synths to coat the atmosphere. It just feels like a good opening song that sets a mood of dread. You know, the song itself is about the zombie horde mode, which is also like a huge popular thing within gaming that just completely missed me. I have played COD Zombies a couple times on some of the Black Ops sequels, but I wasn't in that late night horde. Mine was Gears of War. I also think that as far as like having the band's panache on full display in a relatively idiosyncratic but well-harnessed fashion, Not Ready to Die is a good showcase for Avenged Sevenfold to shine. Also, within the context of it being the first song with this new drummer, the idea of not being ready to die just feels like a good sentiment for the band on their first album, also without said fill-in drummer, which was Mike Portnoy, who played the stuff that the Rev wrote for Nightmare. This isn't going to be a discography review thing. I'm just giving context for those that don't know Avenged Sevenfold, but have interest in, like, song placement within a record sequencing wise. It's got a good dramatic bridge. It's a good beefy song as well to just kick the record off on a strong foot, similarly to records like City of Evil and Nightmare. That doesn't really have a whole lot to go with the lyrical thematics outside of the whole, again, not being ready to die, not being ready to face one's own consequence, a through line that is seen throughout the narrative of the record itself, Hail to the King, which, speaking of Hail to the King, the title track is the song to follow, Not Ready to Die, which is how it is in the original track listing, and I think that that is a great place for it. I think that if you're going to have a character piece and a character piece, I get that in the original track listing. I just don't think it translates well on the original. But I do think that having the title character come in the beginning is a good idea, and I think that its flashy guitar intro helps add to the sort of character theme that the song has. It's a very energetic, bombastic track that I think introduces the character of the king really well and has a bit of his personality sort of showcased, but doesn't quite get full display until the following track. It's just a strong song that I think was used well in the original album sequencing, and I just kept it here for that reason. Similarly to that, I also kept Doing Time in the original place as it was in the original track listing. I think that it's a great follow-up track to that. I think that it's a leaner, album cut ass song whose songwriting style feels a little more character driven. It feels like you're in the POV of the king speaking to sort of the people he sees beneath him. It's a point to sort of show the king's character in a lean groove driven song that I think utilizes its clean production well. I think the bass is good. I think that the drums could use a little more flair. It's a moment that I do feel like sort of showcases some of the more simplistic driven drums being a problem to me, but it's not as bad as some of the tracks that I did cut, like This Means War, which would take place after this in the track listing, but I cut because while I'll talk about both added tracks sort of feeling like Avenged Sevenfold getting idiosyncratic, both tracks do so better than the experiments or bogged down nature of the two tracks that I scrapped. I'll talk about Planets later, but I think that This Means War is easily one of my least favorite songs the band's ever made. While I know that it's the point where that leans the heaviest into that inspiration for the sonic pivot, I just think that it's the laziest version of that. I hate that song. I know that it's supposed to encapsulate war and battle, but they've done other stuff in the record and throughout this era that I think just showcases that better. But I do think Doing Time as a point in the track listing makes sense, and I like that too, so I kept it there for that reason. There are two tracks sort of about the king and from the king's POV, it feels like, before the dramatics get introduced even further with Requiem, a track that has another chorus intro but with like a ghost style choir intro to add to the gravitas and theatricality. And it's also a point where they sort of lean into that influence from that era of like hard rock, but again, kind of pull it off in their own Avenged Sevenfold sort of way. It's a moment that still feels like it's written from the king's POV, but after a vision of his own demise, his own judgment, his own downfall. And it's a point where he gets, reflective inside, and it's a point where you sort of get the other side of his coin because it's sort of been forced out. I think that it has a similar songwriting style with its chorus to Planets, but I think it just sounds better on Requiem, and I think that it's a track that sort of leans into those gaudier aspects a little better than some of the tepid ideas from a track like that. And I think that it sort of still feels like a good early record cut, so I just moved it up in the track listing, and where it would normally sit, I also bring up Crimson Day, because I think those two tracks also sit well together in the original track listing. It's a moment where it sort of slows down before slowing down even more with Crimson Day, a part where he sort of looks upon that future of destruction a little more intimately and really mourning his own life, the loss of his own life, his own demise really sort of setting in internally. And I think that it's a moment that makes sense where it sits in the track listing, but again, in lieu of trimming or pushing the battle aspect of this back a little bit, I have this moment of reflection prior to the madness, and a point where he really where the king sort of looks within deeper, with this clean guitar backing it. It's a moment that sort of also just sonically acts as a sort of cool down, because it's kind of been having this rager-filled opener with a little bit of leanness, but still some, intensity to the backbeat and some gravitas. I just wanted to sort of wind it down incredibly slow. And again, I sort of keep the record in its original track listing pacing-wise here, because this is where Heretic comes in. This is just probably the strongest stretch of the record as far as, keeping the pacing in flux gracefully, because while Crimson Day sort of fades out, Heretic sort of winds back in and reins the listener into reality, as it were. We've spent a lot of time internally with the king the last couple tracks, but now we're at the matter at hand. The antagonist, the Shepherd of Fire, is on the horizons, and Heretic is his sort of precursor track, at least in the context of my track listing. It's another groovier driven song, the bass really rings out on here, but it's a track that sort of sees the band tying the worlds of their influence on here with their own style. Sinister and Johnny Christ's guitar play sort of just feel very classic Avenged, while seeing narratively the king in the present more confronting his judgment day head on, seeing his day on the horizon and his moments prior, before Shepherd of Fire finally comes into the fray. It's a track that also leans into the gravitas of the record, but having it come at this point in the record, after having teasings of it, it sort of just fits a little better, in my opinion. Because, again, it's a strong track, and I think that, again, songwriting-wise, similarly to Hail to the King and Doing Time, they sort of feel like they're written from a POV, or, again, it's a character piece, so it kind of also has moments where it leans into the character entrance style, especially with its thematic build-up. And I think that it comes in at this point of the record to sort of keep the listener in a groove really strongly. It's nothing too flashy, nothing too fast. It just sort of keeps the listener in this pocket. And while this is normally where Coming Home would come in after Heretic, I instead inject the battle. I start the confrontation here. We are amidst the climax, the building, crescendo that the record's been going to, with Carry On, another track recorded for another Call of Duty game, this time Black Ops 2. I did not buy Carry On when it came out, but I had heard it. Never really got into Blops 2 when it came out, but I have played Blops 2 after the fact. I've played it sort of in hindsight with friends, recapturing their nostalgia. And it's fun. I like zombie mode. Again, I haven't played the campaign or multiplayer, but this is where I have played Nazi Zombies, and it's fun. And Carry On is, again, another moment where the band sort of just crafts an Avenged Sevenfold song, but it fits the sort of intensity of battle well. And I think that as far as, adding a song to replace one, again, to showcase Aaron L.J.'s drumming capacity a little better. While Planets isn't a terrible song on Hail to the King, I do think it is a weaker moment in the track listing. Again, I mentioned it briefly, but I think that the bridge of that song, while repetitive similarly to Requiem, I just think it's so fucking repetitive. It's a moment where I think the record sort of slogs. It really kind of feels bogged down by Planets, and I think the Carry On just kind of spices it up with a good dose of energy, especially following Shepherd of Fire. It's a good sort of reintroduction to some energy that I think gets carried through the back end of the record pretty fucking well. But I think that Carry On isn't anything super special songwriting-wise. It just feels like a battle song to be a battle song. It's flavor text in a similar sense to Planets, but I think it just is really well done on there. It's not quite as colossal, maybe, but I think stripping it down to a moment like this, similarly to Heretic, sort of just keeps the record tied to Avenged Sevenfold a little more strongly. Which, Coming Home following that, carries the energy, but ties it a little more to a world of reality, because the album sort of parallels the struggles that the King would be facing with the narrative as it's been to their own struggles, and I think that it's a good point where the sort of meta crosses over in a strong way, while also having a moment where the band sort of keeps it on brand sonically, but I don't think it falters for that. I think that it's another decent track written by the band that feels like them sort of experimenting or branching off of almost their self-titled era in a strong way. I think it acts as a better penultimate track too than Planets, which is why it's following the penultimate track on the original and in the sort of narrative of Acid Rain being the resolve, you know, seeing the band at the end of this album and the king at the end of this album. One feels reborn, the other left behind, which is sort of a broader narrative comparison one could make to this, which is why I made St. James a track after this in my Redacted. But I could see somebody ending the album on Acid Rain, because I think it's a strong closer for the record that sort of reintroduces some of those ideas sonically from Hail to the King into the record to give this album a really strong ending, a strong resolve, while leaning into some of the sort of gravitas that could feel missing from a track on Planets. I think it more sort of rounds out some of those grand ideas without feeling too derivative or overstuffed, you know what I mean? But I kept St. James because I think that as far as like having a dual side to a lot of the ideas on here, you know, you got the King and the Shepherd of Fire, you've got the narratives of the band themselves and the King. I think it would make sense to have the King also represent the Rev in a sort of way, and I think that having the album close on St. James is a sweet sentiment on top of that. I don't know. I could see somebody listening to it or making their own version if they like my Redacted without St. James, but I'm keeping it in mind because I think it's a decent enough closer, and I think that not 42 minutes doesn't necessarily make this album feel too short, but I think that having a sort of coda to round things out is a nice sort of chef's kiss to send the album off into the sunset. I also think that the intro from St. James bleeds really well in from the slow burn outro of Acid Rain. I don't know. I like the song. I think it fits some of the ideas I got in play, and again, that's why I keep it here. And that's how I would lay out Hail to the King. Do you agree? Do you like this version? Do you like how I've described it? If you'd like to listen to it, there's a YouTube and a Spotify link linked in the description. Thank you so very much for watching. If you liked it, give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 3 vids a week, depending on what I've got going on. We are in the middle of November, and we got some fun stuff still coming around out the month, while also seeing some ideas get cast off into the horizon by this week's end. Hopefully you're enjoying what I got going on. But either way, thank you again so very much for watching. I'm going to go. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.